Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the BDR in Berlin. The project is a cooperation from the BDR Berlin Gallery Space, the KU Leuven, and the Bochum University of Applied Sciences. What it is all about. Wechsel, STOFF, wechsel is the title of the exhibition. It is all about the material turn in architecture. The exhibition discusses the question of what contribution material in architecture makes to the challenges in time of climate change. Material as stored energy is a game changer in the development of sustainability architecture. The conventional view that material is something permanent, closed off, rigid, unchanging is now shifting. A new concept of material has a radical influence on the idea of space and architecture. Our installation here in the gallery is a video and photographic essay. It shows research work and material samples from the KU Leuven, especially a project donated by Rachel Armstrong, Chemical Landscape, and the University of Applied Sciences in Bochum, and the Federal Institute of Material Research here in Berlin. All these material samples deal with aspects of time scale, structure, aesthetics, and the transformation. Following Mies van der Rohe's concept of material, we asked in this installation how new materials will change aesthetics in architecture. On the wall, you see projections of students' work from Leuven and Bochum and Rachel Armstrong, showing experiments with dust, trace elements, and bio-based materials, and so on. And on our lab table, here at the wall, here at our lab table, you will find samples from our research departments at university and from the Federal Institute of Material Research. We invite you to explore the new aesthetics potential for a next step in sustainable architecture. This is my colleague Ludwig Heimbach from the BDR Kuratorium, architect and teacher at several universities. And my name is Astrid Bornheim. I'm also architect here based in Berlin, and I'm teaching at the University of Applied Arts in Bochum. We are really glad that we have international guests today, and a warm welcome to Rachel Armstrong and Jan Wurm. And I invite Ludwig to introduce our dear guests.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to have you, Rachel and Jan. You are the guests from KU Leuven in the end. You are both professors in regenerative architecture in the Department of Architecture at KU Leuven. And what is interesting with Rachel is that she also has a degree in medicine. And as far as I know, you really worked also as a doctor, and you have a PhD from Bartlett School of Architecture, so that's a bit of the background. And if you're interested in, she is a senior TED fellow, so check up in the internet on several TED Talks. I got to know Rachel by an article, I think more than 10, 12 years ago. And I remember also work of her at the Biennale. When was that? 2010 or something. And until this time, I have a close look to her work. And I think it's super inspiring. especially in the vision what the field of architecture might go in the future. And I think her view is now more and more important to our field due to climate change, and which is now very obvious, the changes which have to happen. And then we have Jan Wurm, also a professor of regenerative architecture at the Department of Architecture in Leuven. Jan is also very closely tied to ARUP, as he is the leader of the research and innovation at ARUP Europe, and also was the leader of ARUP Material Skills. And what is interesting with Jan is that he first studied architecture, but then did his PhD more in the constructive direction. The book, I don't know if it's also in English, but the Glastektonik, Strukturformen von Flachglas, it's still, I think, one of the basic literature on structure of glass, still with Birkhäuser Verlag, as far as I remember. And here in Berlin, for example, he was responsible for the constructive design of the facade of the Futurium with these special, let's call them glass tiles. And so we are very happy. Actually, I was very happy to teach last semester with you two at KU Leuven. You invited me over, and we will start our talk with a short. You will give a short overview of your work. So I think Rachel will start, or would you like to start?
Yes. Should I share my screen? Is that the?
I think that's the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go then. So I'm going to just give a basic overview, really. I'm going to start with a material philosophy. In the introduction, it was suggested that maybe it's new materials that might shape a future of architecture. And I would argue that actually there's a very basic attitude, a material philosophy that modernity has given us that I think has constrained our ways of thinking about materials, for example, performing work. So we look to machines as the systems that perform all the work, and we really don't look to the material realm to do things that technological systems do. So I really want to start with a philosophy of a changing world, which is at the heart of my work. And really, kind of drawing on Duchamp's notion that, the only change itself is change is the kind of the fundamental thing underpinning all things. And so how do we actually deal with that? I think in modernity, we are ridiculously poorly equipped to deal with things in motion and things to do with change. And my story, even let's appreciate Heraclitus and the idea that, you never stand in the same stream. And the man that stands in the stream is also never the same. So that change is a constant. But in the medieval times, before this concept of the metabolism, this idea of materials in change, were these alchemical notions of transmutation and metamorphosis. And I'm going to quickly go through what they were, because this was actually a way of trying to express the way that bodies changed, the way that nature changed. And mainly because we are creatures that live on land rather than in the water, that we have this idea that there is a kind of environmental permanence, even if we can see change happening slowly. If we lived in a river, we'd see things, kind of moving around very fast, but we live in a rarefied medium, air. And things appear to be stable in this medium. But even the ancient, Greeks were thinking about how bodies changed, and they thought about it in the relationship of the generation of life through things like spontaneous generation. And by the time we get in the Enlightenment, we're starting to have people like William Harvey thinking about, well, how does a chicken come out of an egg? You know, what are the physical, you know, what is the mechanism through which something that looks like a stone becomes something that looks like a bird? And there were lots of theories about why this change took place in metamorphosis. Most of those were about preformation. And then with the age of modern biology, particularly experimental practices like zoology and biology in the 19th century, research methods that started to test these theories became possible to give us a more dynamic view of what's happening. But the other aspect is really about this idea of transmutation, about how one body becomes transformed into another. You can see that these two ideas, you know, are really quite entangled. And Nicholas Voegelin, he was looking at chickens and eggs and was really thinking about, well, how does the calcium in the eggs and feces of a bird get there? You know, the idea then that there was a kind of chemical process that allowed, particularly chickens and eggs were early themes of looking at this kind of transformation. But the idea of an animal economy or animal, what becomes metabolism comes out of these two alchemical concepts. And it really kind of interchangeably starts to be used during the 18th, 19th century, where the idea that bodies change because they take food in, because the food is digested and it becomes new flesh, it becomes an established theory, becomes a scientific practice. But even now, the ideas of how that happens are still very difficult to articulate. And so in the early 20th century, we had this idea of systems and cybernetics. You know, it's not that we're devoid of these things. It's just that we have, you know, competing models for thinking about matter and how matter changes. So on the one hand, if we think through flow, we don't get form. And if we think through form, we don't get flow. And systems and cybernetics was really there to create a framework through which we could start thinking about how things were exchanged. But in the kind of 20th century systems and cybernetics, there's no real material transformation. What we start to get, even when we put computers in to visualize relationships, we get descriptors rather than programs that can be implemented. So here, for example, you've got something that looks like an ecosystem of metabolism. This is Barabasi. And although you can see all the little dots and sticks and there appears to be a spatial relation, it's really hard to be able to read from this particular picture as to exactly where you start in something like hypertension. You know, which molecules do I now start to grasp at, and at what time scale and in what order? So although systems is a very nice way of thinking about connectedness, it is really still a picture. So how do we start to actually get a sense of the material engagement, the landscapes in which we are immersed? And this is where these chemistry visualization experiments came about, to try to actually introduce matter in media that were more fluid. So these are gels. And so introducing salts using 19th century origins of life-based chemistry experiments to actually start to look at fronts that move through processes like diffusion, so very physical processes. And you can see that, you know, very interesting forms and islands of precipitation and rediffusion and redissolution and kind of shaping a material interaction actually become quite dynamic. And from that, then I was looking at, you know, how might we start to scale this, you know, from a visualization system into something where we actually start to live the systems of cybernetics and realize them through liquid flows. So this is the Living Architecture project, using microorganisms such as microalgae, but also bacteria, microbial fuel cells, and synthetic biology, in order to start to create interfaces through which chemical transformation and exchange takes place. So all of these little bricks here are like little stomachs. They've got membranes inside, and the microbes are generating end products that become the food stuff for their neighbors, let's say. So, from my work, really, I've started to think that actually we have a kind of metabolic weather, that there aren't just fronts and, kind of bodies, but actually, there are all kinds of energy gradients, katabatic flows, dust clouds, pollutions, and kind of a myriad expression of matter that is both inside bodies and outside of bodies. And really, I think that this dynamism, as Heraclitus observed, is really setting the scene for processes of lifelike events and even life itself. So for me, this is the lens that I bring to the built environment. Hopefully we can have further conversations about that. But that is just really to set the scene of a language of a world or matter in action.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think your idea of this of architecture as a metabolism, that is the thing which is, of course, in the title of the exhibition, and in your book, Safe as Houses: More Than Human Design for a Post-Pandemic World. I think you are also going into this realm. Might be could you tell us a little bit? I would be interested in the fact of a kind of communication between the user of a building, let's say, or a built environment, to these metabolic architectures, and how far they communicate. These two types of metabolistic structures, let's say.
Yeah. So when we design a geometric volume, it's imagined to be a static space, and yet a static space has to support a living body, and living bodies are dissipative structures, essentially chemistries that possess form because they throw out energy to stay stable, and flow, which is really the basis of the metabolic exchange inside them. So if we design environments that are meant to be permanent, they are kind of anti-life. So the question then becomes, how do we actually start to approximate these worldviews? Well, I think it is really about how we reimagine the geometry. So, I'm kind of thinking of the endless house, that the idea of these kind of persistent flows, we can't see them easily. But when we make them visible, through I guess we see them most in kitchens and bathrooms, and where dirt and grime gathers, and where we get molds on the wall, when we get microclimates, when we get spaces that lose that homogeneity, that's when we start to see the presence of another kind of architecture. And there's a question of scale here, because obviously at the human scale, events happen at a time that we can perceive, but at the micro scale, things are happening also, but maybe our perceptions, really can't register them. So I think that in this day and age, when we're really trying to bring together the static boundaries of the geometric language that we have imagined for architecture, and this kind of dynamic, dissipative environment in which life exists, I think there are different stages and different scales in which we can start to let's say bring the different worlds into proximity. And I think that's where biodesign and some of these bioarchitectures and regenerative architectures, start to make new connections.
Rachel, I really appreciate your term of metabolic weather. And when I look at your films you sent us for this installation, as you mentioned, there's a lot of aesthetic work in it and a lot of aesthetic material to discover in the microscapes. How do you think can we use the aesthetic aspect of your research to motivate everyday people, everyday consumer of architecture to accept this new concept of material and this new concept to see the world?
Yeah, I think this is very present in the new wave of bioreceptive materials, because when we think about the patterning that is used on bioreceptive materials, those little the patterns are there to create microclimates and specifically channel the flow of water, because the presence of water again is something that we have value factored out of modern architectures. You know, materials and water don't really go together in terms of permanence, but you know, water is a universal solvent and, you know, likes to go everywhere. But I think what's interesting about the bioreceptive surfaces is that it is the design detail that allows the kind of tracking of water through space, and it kind of stays with water, it plays with water, it invites water, but allows it to move on. And I think that that kind of you know, staying with and being with the flow, you know, in these micro channels, really are the first signs, I think, that design is now just starting to actively design with life, because we need to work at that level of detail in order to create the conditions for, you know, healthy plants, healthy people, you know, healthy landscapes. But I think we're designing at different levels of detail now.
Might be the term of water is very nice to go now to Jan Wurm, because actually in classical building construction, I was taught that the enemy of the architect is water. And I don't know if this story is too private, Jan. I know when your second examiner was Wolfgang Döring at RWTH Aachen, as far as I know. He's smiling. And you told me that...
I just wonder what you're telling now.
Yeah, well, Wolfgang Döring, I don't know if you know him. I think he was a guy of the skin and bone building construction coming from Eiermann. And seeing Jan's diploma, he said, well, if something like this is a diploma, I'm happy to retire. And I think that's
actually true.
That's true. And Klaus Kader was his first examiner. I was super enthusiastic about the work, but Wolfgang Döring, and I think that's very interesting that Jan, after that, because there are many students in the hall, after that went into this constructive, very constructive direction. And so, Jan, might be you tell us a little bit about in how far water is the enemy of the architect anymore.
We can talk about water maybe later on in the discussion, because I have prepared some slides. I would like to take the audience through some of the work we're doing at KU Leuven. Yeah, and it focuses a little bit on the role of materiality. And when you say constructive engagement with the material, to me it sounds like it's one part of it, which is a very, I think, traditional way of separating disciplines and looking at architects and engineers and, you know, a scientist. And I think the beautiful thing with when we talk about materials, it's really hard to separate and to say that it's something which can be taken in different components and looked at in the way we look at construction or architecture today. So I look at material really as something holistically integrating all aspects of design, of course, including the technical aspects of it. Now I want to share my screen and look at it where I find my presentation. Is that coming up? Yeah, perfect. So, because I think your briefing, Ludwig, was to address the different scales when we talk about materials. And the angle I'm looking at now is to look at the scale of the ecosystem, the industrial ecosystem, and the material scale, which are closely linked and which we can maybe question in the sort of transformation you mentioned towards a more sustainable or even regenerative architecture. So on this slide, you see in a romantic way, for sure, the sort of evolution of architectural forms and structural forms from it being a void carved into a solid formation of rock to something which leans into working with linear members coming from the forest to then sort of cultivating that construction system with non-bio-based materials, with stone and bricks, to shape larger spans and enable for larger communities to gather and to convene and to build society, and to then more and more enter architecture, more industrial ecosystem, which for sure from the 19th century onwards, it then deconnects the architecture from its local natural ecosystem and places it into a more global technical ecosystem or industrial ecosystem. And if we look at this slide, which is a nice visualization of what I'm talking about, it shows the container ships at one specific moment in time, looking at those global trade routes and the sort of activity which is going on in that globalized metabolism of transforming material, but disconnected to one place, being creating the need and the demand for transportation of bringing raw materials from Europe to China, producing a product and then shipping it back, for example. And I think this map shows also sort of paths of productivity, but also prosperity, which is all linked to that industrial ecosystem I'm talking about, which, by the way, as we know, got seriously disrupted in Corona times when I think 70 container ships were clogged up in the biggest container ports, really disrupting our supply chains around the world. So it's also a vulnerable system in that way. Okay, but this is based on centralized nodes of transport, but also of production, and we refer to it to the carbon economy, where we have huge amounts of energy available to invest in the scaled production of materials and goods. And in that way, we transform our landscapes and our environments into what we call now the Anthropocene, where natural systems start to disappear or becoming a hybrid, entangled in these industrial systems that we need to build in order to grow the system I've been describing. But we're all aware, of course, of the implications which relate to the transforming of energy into carbon emissions and depleting materials, resulting in these very fundamental climate change that we are seeing, which impacts quality of life in many parts of the world. Now, if we are looking at an alternative ecosystem which might shape materiality and architecture, we go from the left to the right. So on the left side, we could see it's a linear economy that we are looking at, which extracts materials, produces materials, consumes materials, into the more right side, where what we do in terms of architecture and design contributes to restoring materials, to replenishing resources, to produce resources. And all that is only possible working with living systems, as Rachel has described. So there's a very new discipline forming, I think, between architecture, design, and biology. and we are seeing the beginning of it. If I have to look at where we are at the moment, I think circular economy is that transition we are in. And it again refers to the economic dimension, which shapes a different availability of materials and design approaches also in architecture. And this diagram is describing what we refer to when we describe circular economy, which thinks more in loops of bringing materials into higher value levels, let's say, through looping it up. And in our technical world, we refer to the recycling, refurbishing, reusing, etc. I want to look at the biological cycle, and of course, it's intrinsically circular. So maybe this diagram is a bit confusing, but what it also is, it's intrinsically dispersed. It's local. It really responds to different environmental conditions, which makes it very different to our industrial systems, which shapes conditions in order to work. So here we see a constant transformation, which is very local. How can we work with this sort of bioeconomy, and what does it mean for materiality? And I refer to these three sort of system levels or scales that we need to look at and integrate in our architectural practice, where we first need to understand the ecosystem, and I refer to natural or hybrid ecosystems we are working with, at the material systems that it provides us, and in what way these can be transferred to building systems that we are designing with. And there's a good example from Brussels, where I'm living now. I moved from Berlin to Brussels 2 years ago. And it's a small cooperative. It's called Sony Wood, and it extracts local timber from the Sony Wood, which maybe some of you know. It's I think the biggest beech forest in Europe. For sure, it has the highest beech trees in Europe. They are about 250 years old. And what's happening at the moment, that all resources and timber resources across Europe is to a very large degree bought up by Chinese traders. So that material is being shipped to China. It's one of those container boats that I showed at the beginning, where a lot of it is made and transformed into building products for the Chinese dynamic, let's say, growth. And part of it is exported back, and some of it exported back in beech products, which land in Brussels. So this is the sort of the one side of it, and this cooperative looks into a different way to extract those timbers from private buyers with a slightly lower price, but it keeps the material in that local ecosystem and starts to develop or provide materials for chairs and stairs and internal fit out. And it's based around a company of 5-6 people, but it's a very local initiative trying to develop that sort of bioeconomy, and architects working with them work with that limited palette of materials, let's say. Another very good example that probably some of you are aware of is BC Materials. Same sort of thinking, same sort of Brussels bottom-up approach, where a number of architects and designers are now taking the excavation of big building projects, which is declared waste, and redeclaring it as a building material, and then make clay bricks on site or close by to then provide building materials for new constructions. And they have a different suite of materials. So again, a very local bottom-up economy, which seems to gain some traction. And this is the sort of environment the elective I'm doing with master students is set in, which looks at local ecosystems, residue streams, side streams, trying to understand the processes behind and the potential to transform them into building products, and then start designing with them in terms of integrate them into architecture. I just want to give 3 quick examples, which are, I think, exhibited at your show. The first one, the students called the Belgian mussel brick. So Belgians consume 2 kilos of mussels per person and year. And yeah, mussels are mostly calcium carbonate. lime, and if you crush them and mix them with alginate, which is another sea-based aquatic product, you can create quite a mixture, which the students then started to create these shapes and forms with, which feature bioreceptive geometry, captures water, captures nutrients, starting to provide an environment for microorganisms to dwell on. And as these materials start to decay over time, and they do, and the materials are big enough to withstand, let's say, 10, 12, 15, 20 years, it's about designing it with that sort of decay rate. Those materials are then being transferred back into the maritime ecosystem where they come from. So that's one story, and I think a lot of architects in that space, it's about also telling these stories in order to understand what their quality could be. A very different one. This is hemp. And hemp is one of those materials that is highly regarded as a regenerative material because it has many, many benefits on a lot of levels. We're knowing the obvious one. I'm not talking about that one. I'm talking about that the cultivation of hemp plants and re-nurtures the ground. It activates the ground, it cleans the ground. It's a yearly plant. Almost all components can be used, for example, for making hemp ropes. And you see that on the left. So the outer skin of this module is hemp ropes, which repels the water. And then we have limecrete. So again, lime is a recurring element here, or calc, that you mix with the woody parts of the hemp plant, creating hempcrete or limecrete, which is well known. And then on the outer side or on the inner side, they have cavities, and on that you fill with the rest over of the hemp production. And on that you cultivate a layer of mycelium, which then provides an additional thermal and also acoustic layer. So one material, hemp, in very different forms, very different sort of local value chains, which are integrated in this hemp mycelium panel. And finally, the eggshell absorber. So we're talking about calc and lime a lot. This is another form of transformation into calcium carbonate. We eat about 14 kilos of 14 kilos of eggshells per person and year. In the similar way, these materials are being ground down to different granularities. So from a powder to more bigger components mixed. And the residue of the egg white, which is there, is acting as a binder when you press it together. And here they created this layered eggshell panel, which consists of different densities from an absorbing interior surface to a water repelling egg art on the outside. So it's all a little bit about scale, right? So they collect, and the idea is to collect these egg and organic waste from local bakeries or manufacturers. I calculated how many absorbers you could do in Belgium alone if you would have an effective way, of course, of collecting these and processing them in a local economy. You could make 600,000 panels out of it. So there is a really fundamental scale, but the material resources are very dispersed and fragmented at the moment. But it's possible to look at it into more scalable systems, as we've done when we were working with Mogu, collecting waste materials to cultivate these mycelium panels, absorbing panels. I just want to show that yes, it's a research and academic sort of elective, but it's very relevant to create new products and business propositions. So finally, we are looking at this new palette of materials, which comes in very different shapes, textures, patterns, but we do need to understand what they can do and what they cannot do, and work with their weaknesses, let's say. As they store carbon, as they have an active part to store carbon and provide ecosystem services, we're not restrained by naturally the amount of material that we use. So here, the more material we use, in a way, the higher the ecological benefit. So it turns a lot of paradigms upside down. And for sure, and now I come back to you, Ludwig, they do transform over time, whether it's UV or water or humidity. And you need to design with these processes when you design with these systems. and go away from an idea that architecture is static and will not change and has to be controlled in all ways. So I think here we need to embrace change. And when we work with these materials, we open up, I think, a new dimension of design, which is designing with time. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jan, for your inspiring contribution. I really like the muscle brickstone, which is on the one hand very simple and complex at the same time. It has a certain kind of humor. It's local and it's modern. It's perfect in a way, but it changes during time as well. What would you think? How can you install this kind of design thinking in the everyday practice of the office, in an architecture office, and what should be necessary to motivate consumer politicians, people who are willing to give money for these kinds of products?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because I don't want to go into an academic corner of producing ideas which are interesting but not being able to being applied and provide better solutions to help us in changing the environmental impact of our profession. So we look at it in two ways. We look at it being applied on the interior, and a lot of materials are available for that. A lot of materials that I've showed, they are good to be used in a controlled internal environment. And we use lots of materials which are much higher embodied footprint or ecological footprint than these materials. So I think we should work ourselves from the inside out to the very controlled environment, and then push those materials into layers of acoustic insulation, thermal insulation, and all of that already exists. The system challenges a little bit more the price maybe, and the performance, of course, at some level, but they are performing materials, and because they have an intrinsic smartness about the patterns, you can do many things you can't do with conventional materials. The more we move to the outer and to the non-controlled environment, and depending where we are, of course, we're facing non-compliability with durability issues, for example, and that's a much deeper issue, where we have to embrace change and have to reconsider some of the technical requirements we have to open up that these materials can be used. So we're looking very pragmatic, applied on the interior, where these solutions can be applied, and we're working with companies to bring them to scale. And then on the outer, it's a more visionary approach to change behaviors and assumptions and maybe approaches in that field.
Well, one thing. What do you think of the entire field of norming? Because from my practice, that is one of the basic problems, that everything has to be in norms, and when you try to put something new, especially on the material level, it's very hard to get this into let's say on a building site with no too big problems for an architect.
So norms are a very important tool to make sure buildings are safe, and that we know what the quality of the building is. I think the more knowledge we have and the more tools we have to assess materials and local conditions, and to make sure that we apply the right condition for the right project, norms get really in the way, because they can only look at a static defined case, let's say, which wherever you are, you have to apply to. So it, of course, tries to capture most of these use cases, but it will always simplify. So simplification on mass available products, I think, is a good idea. On dispersed local biochains, it's a really big barrier. So I think here we need to address maybe by a more, not a prescriptive norming, a more performative, performance-based norming, where we know the building is safe, we know it will stand up for 30 years. It will perform according to the U value, but it looks different than in the norm. And I think if we could get there, I think we could make a lot of acceleration.
Thank you. Maybe this is a good moment to open the discussion to the audience. Is there any question to our colleagues in Leuven? Yeah?
So this is Jan. Hello. I'm wondering, I was really impressed by your visions and patterns and technologies and natural inspiration. I'm wondering, is this just a playground of architects in an academic context, or do we have a chance to inspire investors to move the next step? You said so nicely, we have to embrace change. However, at least here in Germany, we are quite skeptical concerning change. So what's your experience with investors, for example, in this field of experimenting with new material?
Yeah, I can make a first comment. I think we've seen a lot of change now in the last 3-4 years because of the Green Deal, because of the decarbonization trajectories, and mainstream developers do now care about carbon and their carbon footprint, because it's also now tied to ability to get financing from the market through the EU taxonomy. And if we look at these 55 reduction till 2030 and 100% reduction till 2050, if we really bring that into how we build, it's a significant disruptive change. In some parts, you need to decrease carbon by 80-90%. And that's now a legal framework, or it's going to be a legal framework. The solutions, of course, are not there yet. But building with bio-based materials that store carbon is becoming a business priority, I think. And by, I've shown one system, which is a scalable commercial system on the market with mycelium. It's there. It costs double than conventional system, but it's there, it performs. And I'm working now with a leading system supplier that wants to do high rises in hempcrete. Things are changing. And then when we talk about money, I think investors play a big role, of course, but they're institutional investors. They are the pension funds. And also the framework for these funds is changing. They are now tied to sustainable outcomes. So they have to show to their members or those in the pension fund that the money they invest in projects actually has a sustainable value. And for that, not all projects qualify anymore. And you now have to, if you present projects, have to be different than others in order to attract these funds. There's a lot of change happening. Of course, we want to see it in the bigger scale, but it's not just happening in an academic world. But what we can do in the academic world is to open up the sort of closed discussions and understandings that we have at the moment. But I do agree, we need to bring it into practice. And that's for sure the biggest challenge is to bridge that valley of death between great solutions and applied practice.
So
now that was my Rachel.
I think in terms of materials and material flows, I think what I'm looking at is looking at waste streams. So whilst one set of waste streams might go to bio-based materials, which would be agricultural waste streams, I'm looking at, let's say, the grey water and black water and organic wastes and how they can be transformed through microbial actions into energy sources, into cleaned water, kind of decontamination of waste streams. And I think that the economy, so we're doing prototypes at the moment, that we're looking at different kinds of toilets, toilets that will power your phone. toilets that will, do street lighting with LEDs. So what you get is a kind of material economy. So not everything goes through the marketplace, and being able to transform your waste, I think, at a community level, I think we're seeing some activation of the commons, activation of community through some of these prototypes. It's slow to roll out at the moment. We are, looking for big investors. We've applied for accelerator funds with the EIC. That hasn't happened, but we're getting bigger and bigger projects. So I think at some stage, and we also had interest from JC Decau, for having toilets that can transform urine into plant matter, food and electricity. These things are happening. It's just really being, and what we're doing in academia is working with the corporations to try and actually get these solutions into the both productization, but also a kind of a cultural, social, critical awareness of the limitations and benefits of these things. So really, when we look at material transformation in its most dynamic sense, we're really reactivating waste streams and turning them into a whole range of products and services.
Okay. Rachel, that's very interesting what you're saying. What does this kind of thinking, what does the material turn mean in the field of further education for architects? Do we need a complete new pedagogy or a new kind of long life learning maybe that install these kind of ideas in the everyday practice of an architect?
I must say, I have really enjoyed working with Jan and Ludwig in terms of being in studio and discovering, some of the challenges that we need to address in studio. I think the systems approach is really, really interesting. Looking through systems at new materials, their integration, and really figuring out what the evaluation criteria are for things that are still quite experimental. But I think you're looking at an interdisciplinary, perhaps a transdisciplinary education for young architects. And actually, I think what we need to provide is actually the support for them to learn a basic form of research through which they explore the opportunities and the potential of the context that they are finding themselves in. We really need leaders in terms of, kind of architectural practices. And in the studio, we shouldn't just be marking them down because, their mycelium biocomposites don't look the same as Mogu's. What we really need to do is to be able to equip them with tool sets, equip them with ideas, and support them and hold them up, whilst they're trying to make sense of these things. So I think there's a different kind of education, which is not follow the master, but is kind of encountering research at an earlier stage in maybe more informal ways than we might have at kind of PhD level. But I think certainly by masters, the empowerment of students to ask questions of their own and be supported in the studio to explore them, I think is our job right now.
Great.
And might be also the courage to face new kinds of aesthetic, because I think that's in the exhibition here. Might be it's not the kind of material world which is shown here in the exhibition, which you think of in the first place as an architect. And for me, I think a little bit talking to you, Rachel, especially when you are talking about, let's say, going from an Anthropocene to a Biocene in the future, and with a living third skin, that our aesthetic is very much involved from the modern times where hygiene was a very high value, and this language of modernism is very much involved by when we think of Sonnenstrahl from Deuker or whatsoever, from this idea of sun and air to get rid of tuberculosis. and that our notion of our skin we have for ourselves is only working when there are about 500 species on it, right? And not washing everything away, right? So there will be, I think, in teaching, we also have to try to encourage the students to figure these aesthetics which are for everybody new, or not foreseen, or on the first view might be ugly. Beautiful ugliness. What do you think of beautiful ugliness?
You know what, if you've been to the deep sea or seen any of those deep sea creatures, I would say that is the definition of beautiful ugliness, and it's absolutely compelling.
So this is an encouragement, especially to the audience, to participate in the discussion. We have heard about the empowerment of the next generation. It's your time now. I think they are a bit overwhelmed. Ja, eine Frage? Ja, da drüben.
I'll try to ask a question. I mean, I find the topics very interesting, or the topic of biomaterials in both talks very interesting. I wonder, it's sort of something I've been wondering myself while listening to you, how much we're limited as architects also by language. And by wanting to name things. For instance, as I was watching Rachel's talk, I was constantly trying to wonder how I would use those living, breathing things as a paint, or would they make a wall? And yeah, so I wonder, you know, I feel like it's, we can get in our own way of imagining what things can be by trying to match them to things we already know, which is partly to do with the business of architecture and partly to do with language, I think. So it's a sort of thinking out loud question.
Well, I don't have a direct answer. I know that when I'm working with biologists, there is a lot of unclarity on language in terminology, and what we mean by system means completely different things. And I think I understand your question in the way that our domain has a specific set of words, terminologies, which work for us, and they seem to make perfect sense. But as we are expanding the scope of architecture, we need to encourage more interdisciplinary design and collaborations, and then sometimes our words, you know, we need to reword some of our approaches, I think, to make them more accessible. Maybe it's helpful to not to talk about components, which, you know, a wall, ceiling, or I mean more about what it does and the functionalities around it, which then relates and bridges much more to living systems. I think I think you hit a really good point. I just don't I'm also thinking aloud while trying to answer it.
I've been working with Rolf Hughes as a poet, and we've been doing brick dialogues as a way of actually playing with the uncertainties of what a brick is, and exploring the limits of language in that exchange. So that brick itself is like an open glass coffin. It's plexiglass, and within the brick there are, you know, beautiful detritus, you know, copper sulfate, tulip leaves, gold leaf, and the kind of the interior of the brick is really quite compelling for a brick. And so it's transgressing boundaries of what a brick might be, but having the brick in dialogue with its microbes and with its communities as a kind of self-reflective piece, I think is really great to be able to, play with that dimension. And I think it does very much, throw up, creative possibilities. So I think, again, encouraging the interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity to work with the weaknesses and the fuzziness of some of these things, and really try and explore, what intrigues you as a designer, because I think there's a lot of room for innovation here, and I think we are on thresholds and tipping points. That the architectures that we recognize as being formal types right now will not be the kinds of architectures that will be here in 30 times. I think 30 years. I think we're going to see new types of building, buildings that bioremediate. I mean, what would that be called right now? There isn't a word for it, or a building that regenerates soil or cleans the air. I mean, we have a building type and then we'll stick something else on top of it. I think we'll start to get these functions integrated into the construction process and the types of buildings that we make. And just like, skyscrapers didn't exist before the 20th century, in the 21st century, we'll see something that didn't exist in the 20th century. And I think that we are on those tipping points, and I think language is one way to explore that.
So thank you very much, Rachel and Jan. Thank you for your brilliant final statement. Although we have a lot of open questions, I think it's a good moment to come to an end. We have heard interesting positions on the material turn and its aesthetic potential for architecture. Thank you so much, Rachel and Jan, to share your expertise, your amazing expertise with us in this evening. Thank you to the team of the students of the University of Applied Arts in Bochum and the KU Leuven, who were involved in this project and delivered so inspiring material experiments. And a special thank in this evening to the AMM Masterclass Architecture Media Management from Bochum, who made this exhibition and the technical transfer possible. Thank to our material partners, the Bundesanstalt für Materialforschung und Prüfung, BAM. Thank you to our education partners, Reinzing, Krampe-Schmidt Architects and Gera. And thanks a lot to our media partner Competition Online. And great thanks, of course, to our gallery sponsors, Schüco and Zumtobel, who made this space and this lecture series possible. Most of all, thank you all for your interest and participation. If you are curious to hear and see more about the material turn in architecture, come again. There will be an event on May the 24th and June the 6th with Sven Pfeiffer von Bochum, Christiane Sauer, Berlin, and Julia von Werder from the BAM. And stay with us for some drinks and many more good ideas for the material turn in architecture. And thanks a lot to our theme from Reframe Berlin, who also teach video publicistic and media management in Bochum, to share all the technical stuff at this evening so that we can send from the BDR gallery to the World Wide Web. And of course, we invite you to share our space here next time in Berlin. It would be a pleasure to see you face to face and discuss further on.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the news.
Yeah, I'd love to see the exhibition. Okay, bye-bye,
Have a good
everybody.
evening. Thanks,
Good
everyone.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye.